My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so grateful that so many of you are taking time out of your busy day to join us as we engage in this really wonderful conversation. You know, while we're still limited in how we can get together in person, we love using this Zoom platform to engage with you across the country and around the world. And one of the ways this engagement really works well is through the question and answer session that we have with the wonderful speakers who come and share their time with us. So throughout the course of today's program, if you have any questions for our fantastic speechwriters who are joining us today, you can put those questions into the Q&A section of the webinar. That looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using to join us today. Now, if at any point you think you're having difficulty seeing or hearing us properly, if you need some technical troubleshooting, you can put those sorts of questions into the chat section of the webinar, which I will be monitoring and responding to in real time. So once again, any content-based questions for our wonderful speakers today can go into the Q&A section. Any technical troubleshooting can go into the chat section. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to start today's program. Jane?
Thank you, Sam. It's delightful to have you put these webinars together. You really do an excellent job of both identifying fabulous speakers and providing all the technical support to make it possible for people to Zoom in and join us. We are today at a historic moment. We are getting ready for the State of the Union. This will be President Biden's first opportunity to address the nation in a State of the Union address as President of the United States. And so we thought, as the Historical Society, that the wisdom would be to look back at speechwriters who have worked with presidents to create State of the Union speeches. The State of the Union speech is fascinating. It is presented by the president, but is presented at the Capitol to the Congress. And in presenting it to the Congress, it's really a speech to the American people. We have two panelists today, and it is going to be a fabulous discussion if it's anything like our practice when we had our earlier conversation. The first presenter will be Michael Waldman, who is currently the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. The Brennan Center is a national voice on voting rights, money in politics, criminal justice reform, and constitutional law. But Michael Waldman is not here because of his current role. He's here because of his former role as the director of speechwriting for President Bill Clinton from 1995 to 1999. Mr. Waldman wrote 4 State of the Union addresses and 2 inaugural addresses. And so he is going to talk to us about that experience and what it was like to be in the room. His dance partner, if you will, for this conversation is John McConnell, who was the senior speechwriter for President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. He also wrote 4 State of the Union addresses and critical speeches that President Bush had to make, including the speech to the joint session of Congress immediately in the aftermath of September 11th. Before coming to the White House, he worked as a speechwriter for Vice President Dan Quayle and Senator Bob Dole. And so we are so fortunate to have for this conversation 2 experts in what really goes on to create a State of the Union. The way we're going to do this is that I have an opening question, which I'm first going to put to Mr. Waldman and then to Mr. McConnell. And we are then going to have a conversation. And those of you who are listening get to participate in the conversation by adding your questions to the Q&A, and I will interject those questions as we continue this conversation. So put your seatbelts on. It should be a fascinating ride. So, Michael Waldman, you worked for President Clinton. We're getting ready to hear a State of the Union, and all this, and everyone's thinking about what controversies are swirling around the current president. When you were working with President Clinton, what were the controversies that were swirling about as you were writing a State of the Union address? Tell us.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jane, for having us. It's always a great pleasure to be with John McConnell. I edited a book of great presidential speeches, and one of the speeches that I included was that speech that he worked on to the Congress after the 9/11 attacks. It really lives on. So it's great to be with both of you and all of you. None of the speeches that certainly President Clinton gave matched the moment that we're in right now, where we are all watching with horror and anger at the attack on Ukraine by Russia. And undoubtedly that'll be something they talk about. But what's noteworthy, what is like now, as I think about the speeches I worked on, and you were kind to say that I wrote them, President Clinton once introduced me as the person who typed his speeches. I like to think it was somewhere in the middle, because we got to work with him as he sort of figured out what he wanted to say. It was a time like now of great polarization. The polarized period we're living in now, the polarized political period we're living now, in many ways began in earnest in the 90s. So in 1996, there had been a series of government shutdowns in a fight between the Republican Congress and the Democratic president over the budget. That State of the Union was the capstone of that fight. And then in 1998 and 1999, 98 was just days into the scandal involving the president and Monica Lewinsky. It was a pretty dramatic time. There was talk that he might resign. There was at the same time a new budget surplus that was the product of all kinds of agreements between the Congress and the president. And at that moment, at the lowest moment of his presidency, when his hold on power was more tenuous than it ever was, he stood there and he said, what should we do with our brand new surplus in 1998? I have a simple 4-word answer: save Social Security first. In other words, there was enormous pressure at that point to use that surplus for a tax cut for the wealthy. We wanted to stop it. He said, save Social Security first. And at that moment, you know, the Democrats stood up and applauded, as they were going to applaud anything he said. And then everyone looked at Speaker Gingrich, who was sitting right behind him, and you could see the political gears clicking in Speaker Gingrich's mind. And he decided to stand up and applaud. And then all the Republicans were looking at him, and then they all stood up and applauded. And at that moment, you know, like $1 trillion shifted in the budget from the column marked tax cuts to the column marked Social Security. And it showed the power of this unique platform for any president, even amid challenge and crisis of his own making, that if you do it right, if you have powerful ideas or are willing to mix it up politically, you can actually change things in a speech like this.
John McConnell, what were the controversies that you had to deal with?
Well, you mentioned that before we went live, and I thought, well, there were no controversies in the Bush administration. Where do you start? The main ones that come to mind, of course, are right after 9/11. 4 months later, or 5 months later, the president gave his 2002 State of the Union, and that's when a lot of the focus of people, when it came to national security, started to turn to the broader Middle East and to Iraq, and that was a controversial idea, of course, and it remains so for the rest of his time in office. And so it took up a lot of space in these major speeches to Congress and the nation. The second big controversy, of course, related, was the troop surge in Iraq, which was 2007. And as you recall, the country was no longer united on that, on the question of that war, which it had been at the beginning. There was a very strong bipartisan vote to go into Iraq, but by the time of the 2006 election, a lot of people had soured on it. It was a major political issue, and the Congress went over to Democratic control, and the president, for the first time, had to go and stand in the well of at the rostrum of the House of Representatives with Nancy Pelosi in the speaker's chair. But it was also a historic moment. Of course, it was the first time that you had a woman speaker of the House. And as you recall, President Bush didn't just dive into his speech. He started with a very nice grace note about being the first president ever to begin a State of the Union message with the words, "Madam Speaker." Then, of course, he had to go into the very difficult message he had on the troop surge. But it was it helped us get into that speech by having President Bush making a typically gracious statement to open things up and to give everyone to relax the tension a little bit in the room, which it surely did.
Now, Michael, you talked about the idea of typing the Clinton speech, that the writing of a speech, the State of the Union, is such a momentous statement of where we are as a nation, where the president wants to take us. Take us in behind the scenes. I mean, who did you do an outline? Did you send it around? I mean, how many people were in the room? And John, be thinking, because you're next in this conversation. And I also invite you to, chat with each other. Like, how many people were in the room, you guys, when you were doing this? And how long ago did you, if this speech is March 1st, when do you think you would start if you were making a speech on March 1st?
Well, it's a great question, because as you might imagine, for a speech like this, this is not a speech for a solitary poet in a garret somewhere, with a quill pen. It's a government document. Every word matters. The difference between calling something a priority and the priority might be worth, billions of dollars. And presidents do it differently too. In Bill Clinton's case, the State of the Union was his particularly favorite speech. They were very long. He liked to talk long, and they were dense with policy, which he liked to talk about. And so while for a typical everyday speech, he might not look at what had been written for him in the end till, shortly before he was going to go out and talk. But for Clinton, for a State of the Union speech, he would clear his schedule or really focus on it for weeks at a time. So ours were generally at the end of January or in early February, and he would really begin working on it at the end of November, beginning of December. We would start with an outline. He would very often, one year, I was in 1999, we sent him a proposal for what he should talk about. We hadn't heard back from him, so I was sent on Air Force One on a trip to Rhode Island as a human Post-it note, basically, so that every time he walked by, he would see me and he would kind of wince. And then finally, in that instance, he called me up to the front of the plane. He wrote out an outline on a Post-it note. He pointed to other extemporaneous speeches he'd given in political settings that said, those are the themes I want. And then we were off to the races. And we were also charged by him with reaching out and pulling in suggestions from cabinet members, thinkers and writers, authors of books he'd read that year. He was very focused on things like what Tony Blair, who was his colleague in third way electoral politics, what he had said in his speeches. And we would even, in some years, have dinners with outside advisors to give thoughts. And then there would be a policy process going on at the same time. We always wanted to have, in his case, one big new mountain policy, or with the hill surrounded by the hills, one new proposal, one new idea. And that required secrecy, usually, and with a goal of surprise, but also quite a bit of policy development. Then we'd start sending drafts. These speeches go up to 25 drafts, at least in our case. He would edit them, send them back, and we would meet with him in the Oval Office, never in a small group, always with a crowd of advisors. I would bring a tape recorder, and he did his best writing, in Bill Clinton's case, crossing out between the crossed out lines of stuff that other people wrote for him. He did not want polished prose. He really wanted almost facts and figures, and he wanted to do the music himself. We would go back and forth. And then a few days before the State of the Union, if it was a year that things were working well, which sometimes it did, he would go to the family theater with a teleprompter and rehearse and speak out loud what he wanted to say. And any changes that he made, we would capture in the teleprompter, and he would start all over again. So people think of him as extemporaneous. He was frequently extemporaneous. At the beginning, he would ad lib off a teleprompter, which is really hard, and very hard on the person running the teleprompter, I should note. But by the end, by 1999, 2000, he had written so much of the speech himself. He knew every comma, every clause, what the policy was behind it, what the politics was, who was going to applaud, who wasn't going to applaud. That eventually things calmed down, but it is not an ad hoc or extemporaneous process by any means.
So John,
I remember
what was yours like?
Similar in some respects, and the part about rehearsing in the family theater is always it's always what a president does with the teleprompter. Just in the days before the event, we had a policy process that generated the big ideas that we were sure were going to be in the State of the Union message. We had that by Christmas time, and I remember my colleagues Mike Gerson and Matthew Scully, with whom I wrote all of the speeches you mentioned. We sat down, we did a heavy outline around Christmas time, sent it into the president, and then right at New Year's, he would give his feedback on the outline. And also we got very good guidance from his top advisors, Karl Rove, Karen Hughes, Condi Rice. And then the three of us would start drafting. Took about 7 days, and then it would be circulated to a small group, not the general 10, 15, or 20 around the White House staff that speeches were staffed to, but a small group, really small, 3 or 4 people. And then you would get it to the president, and then you would start the editing process. As Mike mentioned, you'd get to draft 25 or 30, but the difference between draft 25 and 30 there aren't going to be huge differences between those two. At the end, you got your fact checkers coming in, fixing things, but there aren't going to be big thematic changes unless there's a huge event. We were doing this speech practice one time, and the president's Scottish Terrier, Barney, came into the room and started, he wanted the president's attention and was kind of pulling on his pants leg. And I remember a colleague of mine said, you know, this dog doesn't know how privileged he is. He's attacking the president of the United States, and no one is doing anything about it.
John mentioned fact checkers, and there was a difference between when I did this in the 90s and when he did it in the aughts, I guess we call it, which was they had Google by then. And we had fact checkers, but it was a far more cumbersome and far less trustworthy process. In 1996, the speech, which is remembered by most people, if they remember it, is where he talked about the era of big government is over, talked a lot about cultural issues and how the market and social change was upending people's ability to pass on their values to their children and things like that. And I had a line in there that I kind of knew I got from somewhere, where it talked about, you know, things are changing so fast, all that is solid melts into air. And it was in there, and everybody said, oh, that's a really nice line. The president said, oh, that's really nice. And I said, you know, can we find out where that's from? And it went by several days, and finally some young researcher came in and said, oh, I found where that line is from. This is the day of the State of the Union. I said, well, that's great. Where is it? Oh, it's from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So we pulled that out. Clinton, I don't think ever knew. Would have been an interesting headline. President declares era of big government is over, quotes Karl Marx Communist Manifesto. But I think it probably had later generations of speechwriters had fewer of those near miss historical accidents.
One thing that happened once with Matthew Scully and me, we always read the speeches aloud when we worked on these together, and when Mike Gerson, one of the three of us would work, at some point we would read that speech aloud because speeches are for the ear. It's a different kind of writing. Anyway, we had a favorite line in the speech that we couldn't wait to become to be heard by the world. But when the time came to read it aloud, it rhymed. So we had to take it out. And Matthew said, you know, we thought we were Churchill, but we were Dr. Seuss.
See, Democrats were more influenced by the speeches of Reverend Jackson, who had a lot of great rhyming rhetoric. So maybe we used it.
And tell me, like, you talked about the fact checking. Did you have anybody checking grammar? Were people on your case about grammar? Or
you had there were every speechwriter had to deal with this kind of thing. There are sticklers who in the review process you'll always hear from. You'll have pedantic changes made, and you know, I remember Mike Gerson saying at one time, someone said a line violated some sort of a rule, and Mike said, "Style is the conscious violation of rules."
You know, in our case, I'm embarrassed to say the person who was the grammarian and the stickler was the president. We would send him stuff that didn't scan grammatically, and he would change it and object. And I wrote a memoir about my time in the White House and described this as a surprisingly fastidious aspect of his personality, given his generally chaotic way of working, and he didn't like that very much. But you know, Winston Churchill had a speech, and he had a sentence that ended with a preposition, which you're not supposed to do. And someone told him, you know, that line ends in a preposition, and Churchill said, "Mindless pedantry is something up with which I shall not put." So when it's spoken, the grammar is not quite as important as when it's written.
Well, also, the example my colleague Matthew used was, you know, if you write lions and tigers and bears, somebody's going to say lions, comma, tigers, comma, and bears, and take out that and, when in fact it sounds better with the ands in the phrase. Anyway, that's just one of the things you have to put up with in speech writing.
So one of the questions people are asking is, President Clinton was known for long speeches, and you know, several people believed that he was just sort of adding stuff in, and but you've just said, Michael, that it was much more scripted than that. Did he plan to speak long? What was that all about?
He did plan to speak long. I mean, sometimes it would grow even longer than he planned, and he would cut words out and mark on the bottom of the page how many words he'd cut, but then he would add other words back in. He was known, as you say, for these very long State of the Union speeches. He believed, I think he was right, that the public actually was hungry to hear from their leaders about policy and direction at some length without it being sliced and diced into sound bites or talking points. And when he would give these long speeches, he had a lot to say. And what people knew about him, among other things, was they knew his personality, they liked his personality, and they knew that he was really into all the policy and wanted to talk and talk and talk about all the policy details. And that was sort of all part of the package with him. But he would give these long speeches, especially, for example, in 1995. I wasn't the chief speechwriter then. He gave a long speech after the Republicans had won control of the House and the Senate. And in those, it's important to remember, for all of the challenges he faces, President Biden still faces a Democratic Congress, but every single president has had a time in recent decades where they lose control of at least one house of Congress and have to face the kind of what's the tone there. Well, Clinton talked for, I think, an hour and 20 minutes. And every time he gave one of these really long speeches, all the pundits would say, oh my gosh, there he is. He has no self-control. He's so self-indulgent. It's all this boring policy stuff. How does he not know, how he looks? And then the instant polls would come in, and they'd be confirmed by the later polls, which showed that the speeches were massively popular. And in fact, Clinton's viewership would go up as the speech went along. The longer he talked, the more people watched. I think it actually is a sign that we actually underestimate the willingness of the public to hear from politicians, that dreaded, category, about what they want to do. So I know that's not, shorter speeches are usually considered better. Ronald Reagan always said 20 minutes is tops, but Bill Clinton's, the length of his speeches were on purpose. And even his convention reelection speech in 1996, where he gave his acceptance speech, that was kind of like another State of the Union, because he just relished the chance to talk for an hour about, policy.
Jane, I think the Clinton years really established the norm that a State of the Union speech is going to be an hour or longer. Before then, I don't think they went that long. Crossing the hour threshold was kind of a big thing, and not many. I don't think he's the first president to do it, but he might have been. But it was not common, and now it is the norm.
He was the Chuck
John,
Yeager of long speeches, breaking the barrier.
You wrote speeches that were an hour or longer. How difficult is it to try to figure out how long the speech is going to be when you're thinking there's going to be applause, and how do you factor that in?
When you're writing a speech like that, in that venue, again, especially in the last 25, 30 years, people want to applaud. There's a little bit of theater in it. There's lines that are directed toward one side. That's really how it's been done lately. We didn't do one-sided applause lines really for President Bush. We didn't try to do that, and I don't really like how many applause lines there are nowadays. I think there should be stretches of speeches where you draw people in and just get them to listen some, and we tried to do that, but that's not the way things are lately. So to answer your question, you just have to, you think, okay, that's an applause line, and we're going to lose 15 or 20 seconds there, but you don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. You get that speech down, and if the reaction to it lengthens the time of the event, you have to deal with that.
You're pretty aware of how many words per minute there are for different types of speeches. I think typical spoken words are something like 140 to 160 words a minute. For an everyday speech, you assume kind of 120 words, because people will extemporize. For the inaugural address, where we wanted him to be slow down and be more formal, it was 100 words. But it's true. First of all, speechwriters for generations have said, oh, this one we're going to have be a thematic argument to the American people, and not just a laundry list punctuated by applause. And it's usually something of a losing battle. It also helps, though, that you don't need transitions quite as much, because they're all going to be applauding. In Clinton's case, again, different presidents are different. He knew, and he relished knowing, how each line was going to land with who. And you would actually move things around to elicit certain types of reaction at certain points. In the middle of his controversies, that 1998 speech, Speaker Gingrich and again, there was a drive to push him out of office. Gingrich called and said, you ought to aim for some bipartisan applause lines at the beginning. So we moved some things around to start in tribute to two recently deceased members of Congress, one Democrat, one Republican, if I remember correctly, so that everybody would have no choice but to applaud all at once. And before you get to the divided things. And look, sometimes there are points where you want to show the public that the other side is not applauding the thing that you think is popular and important. I would guess, like right now for President Biden, I would guess that he is looking very much to have a unified response from the Congress on Ukraine. The world's going to watch and see if it's everybody applauding or if it's just one partisan faction or another. I'm sure they're writing it in a way, both knowing how you structure a sentence to get applause or not applause, but also in a way to make sure that it's not seen as a partisan response.
John, do you want to speak to how you think they're thinking about addressing Ukraine? Or what advice would you give to President Biden and his speechwriter as he's trying to figure out how to speak about Ukraine?
I wouldn't give him any advice on that. I would say a general advice for the speech, I would encourage President Biden to go back to the theme of his inaugural address, which was unity. I don't think he has done enough of that in his recent speeches, and I think it would matter a lot, especially since it's an election year, if he came across as less of a partisan figure. That would be the general advice that I would give to them, and I haven't heard from them yet. So maybe they're just waiting until the last minute to call me for that advice. On Ukraine, I wonder if Mike agrees with this. I think the foreign leader whose name is most likely to be mentioned in this speech is Zelensky and not Putin.
I think if they could have Zelensky sitting up in the First Lady's gallery, he would be there for sure. He has emerged, in an extraordinary way as a symbol and as a hero. And you almost can see how, in a way, Churchill came to personify British resolve at that moment. And I'm sure you're exactly right. Now, I don't think that either the president I worked for or the president that John worked for, or frankly, any other presidents other than one would say of Putin, he's savvy, he's a genius, as former President Trump did in the last week. I think that there's far more unanimity in the country, generally speaking, on this than there is on most things. The speech that President Biden gave in the last several months that I thought was tonally so pitch perfect, and that could be a tone he could set for this speech, was the speech he gave honoring the police officers who defended the Capitol on January 6th. He talked about democracy and how democracy was under threat. There was a political subtext to it, which was he was fighting for voting rights, but he did it in a way that was poetic, but also was touching on broad unifying national themes. I think the trick for presidents is to touch on those themes, but also make the political points. He's going to want to talk about inflation. He's going to want to talk about the pandemic being in a new phase and the CDC saying you don't have to wear a mask anymore, and things like that. But for Ukraine, I'm sure, would be trying to use this speech as a kind of pivot toward happier news and happier times than people have been getting lately.
So, John, do you have a line that you can say, here's something, I'm so sorry I put that in the speech, or I'm so sorry I left that out? Like, is there some line that you just think, oh, if I had to do over, I would make sure that one was in and that one was out?
There was a time when I could have been able to answer that, because when you're writing, you do have favorites that get that get taken out, especially in the campaign conditions that speechwriters sometimes work in. one line that comes to mind that I wanted to tell the story of at the time, but I thought no one would believe me, was that the president said to us in the Oval Office, we were working on the conclusion of the State of the Union message, 02 or 03. And he wasn't happy with he didn't think what we'd gotten. The idea is that he wanted in the closing drafts of the speech. And we made a couple of runs at it. And we were sitting in the Oval Office. And he said, I want to say that the liberty we prize is not America's gift to the world. It's Almighty God's gift to all humanity. He said, I want to say something like that. And we said, how about just say that? And he said, well, write it and we'll see how it works. Well, of course, it became one of the signature lines of his presidency. And I told my colleagues, I said, I would love to tell the press that story, but I don't think they'd believe us. They think the speechwriters were spinning. But it's true. It's exactly how it happened.
I love it.
He was a very careful, active editor and a confident one, even more so when he was president than when I started working writing for him when he was the governor. Gave us a lot of very good ideas.
Michael, do you have a line that was your favorite that
didn't make
did
it
get in or didn't get in?
I was always pushing, mostly unsuccessfully, for the president to talk at greater length than he was able to about his theory of government and its role, as he was building what he considered to be a third way between big government liberalism and Thatcher Reagan style libertarianism. He, working on one of these State of the Union speeches one night in the residence, he said to a few of us, he said, FDR saved capitalism from itself. That was not a new insight, but FDR saved capitalism from itself. Our mission is to save government from its own excesses, so it can again be used as a progressive instrument of the public will. And I thought that kind of thing, was powerful and important, and it was very hard, often given the press of policy, the press of events, for him to go on at great length about that kind of thing. Certainly in a speech like the State of the Union, those would have to wait for the commencement addresses.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that the State of the Union is given in the Capitol to the Congress, to the American people by appearing in front of the Congress. There are a couple of classic moments where Nancy Pelosi ripped up a speech, where Joe Wilson commented, said, "You lie," right on the floor of the House, where Justice Alito, mouthed "not true."
I was going to say, he basically said the same thing.
Same thing, where, the beginning, I think Reagan was the one who started with the gallery guests. We can have this and that. We can have the theater. It's got some theater to it, but it's not like you get to really direct the whole scenario. So how do you deal with it?
The things you mentioned, participation by the Congress in that way, or acting things out in the ways you described, Pelosi and the congressman shouting at the president. I was on that floor for all of the State of the Union messages I worked on, and I was really bothered by the ostentatious rudeness directed toward the president. Members of Congress reading things, wanting to call attention to themselves as reading something as opposed to listening. And of course, the same thing happened with President Obama, just on the other side of the aisle. And nothing is gained from that. One other thing, the first time I was on the floor of that chamber, I was a page in the Senate, and Ronald Reagan came out to give a message to Congress. And I was standing on the southwest wall of the chamber. And I never realized, you had the whole House, the whole Senate, you had the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Cabinet, the Supreme Court. But I never realized until I got there at age 16 that you had the diplomatic corps sitting on the floor of the House of Representatives, the ambassadors from all over the world. And I was sitting with them. And when Reagan came in down the center aisle, there was a lot of clapping and cheering and everything else. And I started cheering. And I remember there were some ambassadors looking at me and really enjoying my, my moment of happiness. But as you were mentioning before we went on, Jane, you've been in these events. The House chamber is surprisingly intimate, surprisingly small for those who haven't been there and experienced an event like this. You really feel like you're sitting in a small room, and you lose you lose the idea that you had in your own mind coming in, what it would be like. Anyway, that makes it all the more distasteful when there's rude behavior, because it is such an intimate setting.
It's a very human setting. We really, as you say, people are kind of jammed up against each other. It's many more people than usually fit into the House chamber. I love the pageantry of it. I think it's an important unwritten aspect of our constitutional system. As you know, it's in the Constitution that you have to report to the Congress, but it doesn't say you have to go there in person. And of course, George Washington did, and John Adams did, but then Thomas Jefferson thought that was kingly, and also he was shy, sort of mumbled. So he sent it up in writing, and that's how they did it up until Woodrow Wilson. And it really only became this kind of primetime spectacle under Reagan. Reagan did start something that I think is, in some respects, probably the bane of most speechwriters' existence, which is the guest in the gallery with the First Lady. They overdo it. But when it's used well, there's a meta message about those gallery guests. So when Reagan did it the first time, his guest was Lenny Skutnik. And Reagan at that point was cutting government. He was under fire from people for cutting government, from cutting public employees. And Lenny Skutnik was a government worker, but there'd been a plane crash, and he dove into the Potomac on the 14th Street Bridge and saved people. And the meta message was, I don't hate government workers, but also this guy used individual initiative and courage, and we're honoring that. Well, Clinton, very consciously, a few years after that, in 1996, we just had the government shutdown, and there had been all this virulent anti-government rhetoric. And so Clinton introduced somebody who had been in the Oklahoma City building when it was attacked by anti-government terrorists. And we had just come off the days before the government shutdown, demanding, using a lot of the same language, frankly. And so Clinton introduced the gentleman, and he said he was in his office at the Social Security Administration, and the bomb came, and he kept going back in repeatedly to save people. And everybody of both parties stood up and applauded this heroic individual. While they were still applauding, the president said, but that wasn't the last time he was kept out of his office. He was kept out of his office when this Congress shut the government down, and let us all together vow never to shut the government down again. And they were still applauding. And it was a pretty powerful praise for this heroic individual, but it was also a linkage, a political point, a rhetorical point, an ideological point. Too often these gallery lists now are just kind of random, but at their best, they can be part of making the message.
Well, you talk about the gallery, you talk about the First Lady's gallery. Both of you had presidents with pretty influential First Ladies who had a lot to say. How did the First Ladies participate in the State of the Union process?
I don't remember Mrs. Bush being involved to a great extent. I mean, I wasn't there when she was talking to her husband privately, and I know they talked about things, but she didn't get involved in the process that I was part of. She was I wrote a few speeches for her over that period, and she's she's a teacher and very intelligent, hands-on person, and she always made things better with her ideas and thoughts. Very nice person to work with. The same is true, I have to say, for Mrs. Cheney, who I worked with a little bit. I thought, well, she's written books, and I wonder what it's going to be like when I'm writing for her husband as vice president. Is Mrs. Cheney going to get involved deeply in the writing of these speeches? And she didn't. But I did, as I say, as with Mrs. Bush, did work with her a couple times on things, and always very productively and pleasantly.
That's interesting, because Lynn Cheney is, very opinionated, and that I would guess would have a lot to say. As you might not be surprised to learn, Hillary Clinton had a more active role, although it changed over time. For the first one of these speeches, and it was not technically and formally a State of the Union, but the first address to Congress, which for Clinton was in February of '93, it was like a State of the Union. It was a chaotic process, and the stories of pizza boxes piled up and all-nighters, which dogged us all for years thereafter, were really true for that speech, as he was figuring out what he wanted to say about his economic policy. And the speech was something of a mess the day it was due to be delivered. And Mrs. Clinton sat everybody down in the Roosevelt room of the White House, sort of, pounded the table and said, "We've got to fix this." And we went paragraph by paragraph through the whole speech, fixing it and rewriting it. Then after the 1994 election, which was such a rebuke of her healthcare plan, as well as so much of about the Clinton presidency by the electorate, she retreated. And she was involved in specific policy areas, but not in this kind of general way. But I knew she was still engaged. We would get edits back, and sometimes she would edit the speech, and the president would take her edits and copy them out in his own hand, so that when they came back to us, we didn't know that she'd edited it. To give one example, they were very sensitive politically to what her role was. She was very influential, but she was very careful. The public armor that we all saw, which hurt her in her election campaign, really went up around that time.
Now, somebody asks, how did you become a presidential speechwriter? And what advice would you offer to someone who really thinks that might be where they want to go? John, you want to start? Sure.
Get into politics. If you want to write speeches for president, get involved in politics. And if you can write, I've said this many times, if you go to work on a campaign, whatever office you're in, and you can write, and they find out you can write, they will use you. I didn't get my position through a nationwide merit search. That's not how these things are done. You get to know people, you get involved in politics or government. You tell your friends, your teachers, your professors, you tell them what you're interested in doing, because in politics, but in general, people like to help other people and do people favors and connect others. And that was certainly the case for me. A talked to B, and B talked to C, and C knew me. And suddenly I had this opportunity to go write speeches for Vice President Quayle. And then I was worked for Vice President Quayle as a vice president, and then a former vice president. Excuse me. And then the opportunity came up to work for George W. Bush down in Austin when he was beginning the presidential campaign. And I happened to know the two speechwriters that he had just hired, and they got permission from whoever it was that gave the permission, Carl or Karen Hughes, to hire the third speechwriter.
You know, I think that there's no path or training to be a presidential speechwriter. I was a lawyer and I wrote books, I ran a consumer group, but went to work for Clinton as a policy aide down in Little Rock. And then in his presidency, the first major speech that I worked on in my life was his first inaugural address. And he, I believe that happened at least in part because he'd read a memo that I wrote about what policies I thought ought to be in it relating to democracy and political reform. And that was something he wanted to talk about. But then for a few years, I mostly was a policy aide and didn't become head speechwriter until 1995. And it wasn't because I was the best writer, because I don't think I was, but because I could translate his policies and knew what he wanted to say and pull in the people who were going to work with him. And you know, I think that I did benefit from, and this I would encourage strongly anybody to drink in the history, drink in the tradition, the rhetoric, great speeches by other presidents or other leaders. You know, Dr. King, because he was the child of a minister, heard thousands of sermons and absorbed them all. And that was the raw material of his own oratory. As John said earlier, this is a spoken tradition as much as a written tradition. And knowing how things move a room or the people on at home or the policy machinery isn't something you can really learn in a classroom, but you can really learn a lot by learning how others did it, at least in my experience.
Well, I would just add to that, Jane. I've listened to political speeches since I was a little kid. I was always interested in it. And it didn't matter whether it was someone I agreed with or someone I disagreed with. I always found it interesting to listen. And to this day, I listen to political speeches. It's people I agree with and people I don't agree with. And I still decide on the merits. Is that a good speech? Did I like it? And it has nothing to do with whether I agreed with it. You learn by just listening and paying close attention. You know, I was never a fan of Al Gore. We ran against him. But he gave some very good speeches in that campaign in 2000. And I didn't like that, but they were good.
Okay, we're going to have two more questions. So you start thinking, because the last question is going to be, what do you want to see tonight in the speech? But before we get to that, Michael, you said you were a lawyer. Could you both talk about when you have the State of the Union address, do you have to have lawyers look and make sure that there are no state secrets, there's nothing that is proposed that somebody's going to say, oh, it's illegal? You know, I mean, what do lawyers have a role in this?
Yes. I mean, well, and probably the prose sounds like it. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is I think Democratic speechwriters tend to be lawyers and Republican speechwriters tend to be writers, and the speeches might reflect that. Yes. I mean, again, for a speech like this, it's not only the lawyers who need to look at it. Anything relating to foreign policy gets scrubbed and scrutinized by the National Security Council, maybe by the State Department or others. Anything relating to economic policy is carefully looked at. When Clinton was talking, there were, for example, financial crises going on in places like Asia. And if he said the wrong thing about the strength of our economy or about the Federal Reserve or something like that, it could send the dollar, skittering around and have real world impacts. It's always a struggle to keep the force of the prose as it goes through the process. And that process for Clinton, most of the time, was not so bad. For State of the Union, you know, again, you got to be super careful. And I point out it's a young person's game. You need a lot of stamina. I was thinking about it that in our day, I was the speechwriter. The person who was my assistant at the time is now Congressman Josh Gottheimer. The foreign policy speechwriter is now Congressman Tom Malinowski, and all of us were working to try to get our drafts into the president without being stopped by Congressman Sean Maloney, who was the staff secretary. So you know, a lot of folks learn a lot of things they get to use later on.
Well, the staff secretary is one of the most important people, because the staff secretary sends your draft around the review process. And in our case, the first two staff secretaries were both ended up nominated to the Supreme Court, Harriet Miers and Brett Kavanaugh.
John Podesta was the staff secretary in the Clinton White House.
And so, okay, we've now heard your stories about doing this. Put yourself in a different mindset. You know, you are now advising President Biden. You want him to succeed. You know, you could step apart from whatever political agreement or disagreement you have with him. What would you tell him to do, to say, how to come on? Does he wear a mask? Does he not wear a mask? Does he, you know, what is he open with? Give some unsolicited advice to someone who's probably got their speech ready, we should hope.
Well, he shouldn't be wearing a mask, and that would look absolutely ridiculous. But I would say to President Biden, you came into office with great goodwill across this country toward you, and remember that. And the theme of your inaugural address was unity. And that was exactly the right theme for the country. There will be people who want to know whether you really are going to stick with that theme, or whether you're going to give up on it. And I would just say to him, stick with that theme. It made you president. And it also is the reservoir that you can draw from throughout your time as president, regardless of what happens. And I would also point out, in line with that, the country is really behind him on this question of what to do with the Ukrainian crisis. The country is behind him, as they would be behind any president, and are very attuned to what he has to say about our national interest and our allies, and what his purposes will be going forward.
You know, I maybe not surprisingly might give slightly different advice, in that the underlying fact that President Biden faced, I said we had polarization. 70% of Republican voters believe he stole the election, which is a lie. And they believe it because the leader of their party keeps telling them that, and the other leaders of their party won't rebut it. And so it's a challenging situation. Even so, he wants to project unity, wants to project the unifying voice of the country. And I do agree that not just as a political matter, but really in moral terms, he has a duty to speak for all of us on this Ukraine invasion. What we're seeing is a dictatorship and an unprovoked attack on a democracy, however flawed Ukraine's democracy is. With thousands of innocent lives being wiped out, and attacks on civilians escalating today. It is the kind of thing we don't want to focus on foreign policy. We certainly don't want to focus on Europe. I think most people would have said that the relationship between the U.S. and China was the most important relationship, you know, going forward to get right. But we have no choice. History sometimes hands you things you can't turn away from. And I do think that there has been quite a bit of unity between Congress and the president on what to do. Nobody wants to be in a war, but everything short of that, arms, sanctions, and moral support, I think the country will stand behind him. And if we do stand behind him, it'll help us to make the impact.
Well, I tell you, you guys are fascinating, and thank you for your time and really being so warm and open and lively. And I feel like our listeners have a better sense of what has been going on over at 1600 Pennsylvania and at the Capitol as people are getting ready for it. And we'll all have this in our mind when we start watching later tonight. So thank you very much for coming in, for joining us, and for being so collegial one with another. I also want to say, as we always do with this, to our listeners, thank you for being with us. Thank you for supporting us. The United States Capitol Historical Society is a nonprofit. We were chartered by Congress, but we're not funded by Congress. We're funded by our members and guests. And so thank you for being there. Thank you for your support. We look forward to having you join us on March the 8th, International Women's Day, when we talk about what went on in the creation of the very first room in the Capitol named for a woman, named for Lindy Claiborne Boggs. And so we will talk a little bit about that naming and about what it meant to have it named for that particular woman and what her career was like. So we hope you'll join us with that, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Goodbye.